All right, Jews from African and Asian lands. All right, this has been quite a fascinating journey through these different cultures. We have a little bit more. In the next two classes, we're going to do Yemenite Jewry, but today we are in Ethiopian Jewry. We did a lot last class. We went through the customs and terms. We went through the origins, timeline. Today, what I'd like to focus on is these three. The Shulchan HaOrit, I'll explain to you what that means, Sig holiday, and what's next. Meaning, the Shulchan HaOrit is basically the foundations of Ethiopian Halacha. There's a lot of interesting aspects and elements to this, and I basically went through my friend Rabbi Shalom's book, okay, and in this book, he goes through the details and highlights like all these aspects of Ethiopian Halacha. Now, I went through it and organized it into subtopics because I'm nerdy like that, and that's the way I was trained in university. So I'm going to present to you some categories of Ethiopian Halacha. I don't know if people have done this before. Maybe they have. I haven't been through so many academic articles on this, so I organized it based into subtopics. The Sig holiday is the holiday that is a very special holiday. That's the source sheet I sent you, so we're going to go over that. And lastly, what's next? We're going to talk about the next stage for Ethiopian Jewry and some accomplishments, some struggles that are ahead of them. So this is how that's kind of like a general structure for today. So without further ado, let's jump into this topic of Shulchan HaOrit, Foundations of Ethiopian Law. So here is, again, this is my friend Rabbi Sharon Shalom giving a lecture, and his book was really helpful for me to try to understand the differences, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see how different the halacha is, and see that in some respects, the same neshama Yehudit, the same soul, is still present and alive in all the things that they do. So I want to show you that. Okay, so we're gonna just a little bit of an overview. Okay, I started to fill this in, but I didn't finish, so we're not gonna overview that. But basically, we're gonna go overview connecting the old and the new. And I just want to show you the structure of his book looks like this. Okay, so here's a halacha. I'll just talk about this halacha with you off the bat. It says when he talks about Yom Kippur and Shabbat. So this is how his book is structured. If anyone wants to purchase this book, you can find it on Amazon. It's called From Sinai to Ethiopia. Now, and again, if you have any questions or comments, you can put it in the chat section. I will try to check it in between different sections. When Yom Kippur falls on Shabbat, according to the custom of Beth Yisrael, recited Kiddush. Beth Yisrael recited Kiddush and ate a small amount on Shabbos. On Yom Kippur. They ate on Yom Kippur. Gewalt. They didn't want to reduce the sanctity of Shabbat. They then continue the fast so as not to reduce the sanctity of Yom Kippur. Okay, so they're both important, so we have to make space for them. So this is how his book's structured. He talks about the halacha, then he talks about past and present Talmudic halacha, then he offers his opinion what the recommended custom for in Israel should be for the Ethiopian community. So in this case, he says the recommended custom in Israel, what he recommends to his community is the Ethiopian interpretation of preserving both sacred days at once is based on an ancient tradition, which he brings in the previous section. Thus, we recommend that when Yom Kippur falls on Shabbat, the Ethiopian community should continue their custom. Imagine that. They should continue. But how does he find a kind of a way to bridge the two worlds? And that's basically his whole project. Even on Shabbat, they should recite Kiddush over bread or wine, but they should only give food or drinks to the children under age of 7. Adults should not eat or drink anything, not even a small taste. Some propose following the custom of the Rambam to recite Kiddush at the time of the afternoon prayer service, or Yom Kippur actually begins during the final meal. So this is a way he's trying to bridge the two worlds, allowing for them to respect the sanctity of Shabbat, but still guard Yom Kippur the way that Jews do in Eretz Yisrael. That's one example. So sometimes he's lenient, sometimes he finds a middle path like there. And here is a whole other case, which is saving lives on Shabbat. And we're going to talk about this. The Ethiopian community, if someone was, God forbid, someone was drowning or in danger, they didn't save their life on Shabbat because it rubbed up against another value, which is guarding the Shabbat. Can't imagine that, but apparently he can't either, because he said his recommendation here wasn't flexible. He was very strict. So sometimes he's strict, sometimes he's flexible. Although the Ethiopian custom is based on the ancient method, the sages' writings on the value of life have penetrated the depths of Jewish consciousness. Thus, it is absolutely forbidden to continue to follow the Ethiopian custom. And the Beit Israel must immediately adopt the general Jewish custom for all issues of saving a life. So I just wanted to give you a taste of how he navigates between the old and the new. And those are two examples. We're going to talk a lot about that. And basically our topics that we're going to talk about here are, I didn't get to list them there the way I wanted to. Here it says biblical Judaism, purity laws, lack of hierarchy, trust, passion, and fun miscellaneous things like women who, they're mohels, they're people who from the circumcision were women. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. It's really interesting, kind of like where that came from. And we're going to go through each of these topics. So without further ado, let's get going. So Dr. Sharon Shalom, I saw a chat here. Let me just see that. Okay, so here the source sheet is in the chat section for anybody who wants that. We're going to get to that in the third part of the second part of this lecture. So Dr. Sharon Shalom said that what's fascinating about the Ethiopian community is they're like a relic or a geniza from the time of biblical Judaism. And so here are a few examples of that. Again, we talked about that because perhaps some of the traditions didn't filter through their community over time, and they retained some of the older traditions, especially because Rabbi Shalom and Rabbi Ovadia Yosef and other rabbis hold that they're connected to the tribe of Dan, which goes back a long time. We talked about it in the first class. So here are just a few examples. Biblical Judaism. So there's synagogue rituals, sacrifices, prostrating. So let's do the last one. Hanukkah, Purim, and Lag BaOmer. So there was no Hanukkah or Purim or Lag BaOmer in those communities. Those are rabbinic holidays that developed later on, which is quite fascinating. Another example of some of their biblical Judaism, let me just jump right into it. Sacrifices, okay? So here, and Passover in general was celebrated differently. So for instance, this is fascinating. Look at the very bottom of this little excerpt. Preparing the sacrificial offering. In the Bible, they said they took the sacrifice on the 10th of the month and they tied it up. So this is what the Ethiopian community did. At the beginning of the month, they chose a goat or sheep. On the 10th of the month, they brought it to the synagogue courtyard and tied it up there until the 14th day of Nisan, when they sacrificed it. Okay, so there were sacrifices going on in this community. Yeah, when a woman gave birth, she'd bring a sacrifice, or when you did a sin, you could bring a sacrifice to the courtyard. And so that continued. Rabbi Shalom addresses that in his book, like if they should continue it or not. He suggests not continuing it, from what I recall. But here's another, this is a fascinating little section here about the synagogue, how it was separated and set up. And you'll see it's very similar to the temple. It goes back a long time, the structure. So he says here in Ethiopia, the synagogue was called a masjid. People related synagogue with awe as a real temple. Villagers lived in huts, but the synagogue in every village was a stone structure. The building stood out in its form. I'm going to skip a little bit here. Here, I'm skipping to the end of the first paragraph. The synagogue structure was divided into three parts. Does anybody recognize this from how the temple is separated? The courtyard, the hall, and the Kadesta Kedushan. Doesn't that sound like Kodesh Kodashim? Yeah, because it is. Kodesh Kodashim. Oh, Holy of Holies. Only the Kohanim, like in the temple, enter the Holy of Holies. And the Orit, like in the temple, the Torah scroll was placed there. The public gathered in the hall. There were no chairs in the synagogue, which is fascinating, right? People weren't sitting in their synagogues. Prayers were conducted. I just think it's just fascinating in itself. Prayers were conducted while standing and lasted many hours. Okay, so some people complain in our synagogue that you have to stand for too long during the high holidays. Imagine what they had to go through during the high holidays. Thus, many people carried walking sticks on which they leaned when they grew tired of standing. The synagogue courtyards also served as a gathering place for sermons, study, offering sacrifices. Okay, that's where they offered the sacrifices. Also behind the synagogue, reading the Torah and any event of sacred character. The inside of the synagogue was used for prayer services only. When praying, the congregants faced Jerusalem. Before entering the synagogue, congregants removed their shoes, like in the temple, in respect for the sanctity of the site. They spread leaves on the synagogue floor so as not to have direct contact with the floor. It's also connected to certain laws in this context. Inside the Holy of Holies stood the Tevot, the Ark, and the Orut stood on top. Next to the Orit were additional garments for the Kohanim and 2 jars. Pay attention to this. What were in the jars? One with ashes from the Para Aduma, the red heifer, and other with holy water for sprinkling on the sacrifices. Okay, so all this was going on in Ethiopia, and my friend Rabbi Shalom saw a lot of this stuff. So it's fascinating when they come to Eretz Yisrael, how can they be incorporated into the society? And we don't have it's very hard to find a para aduma, a red heifer, and they had their traditions, but it's a very the red heifer is known to be able to purify those who have been in contact with the dead. And we don't have the same tradition as them. It's just fascinating to see that they were continuing that tradition. Another thing is prostrating. So they prostrate in their tefillah. We do that on Yom Kippur. You get down, you'll see it sometimes, not that much in our synagogue. You'll get down and you prostrate on the ground. We don't do that now in our synagogues, but they were doing that in their community. And that's also what we did in the temple. So you see, it's kind of like a relic from ancient Judaism. It's quite fascinating. Another piece that's connected to that is the purity laws. And for this, I actually wanted to read out a little bit of, one moment, some of the menstrual impurity laws. But I'll just share with you. So Jews and non-Jews. So when they went to work, they tried to not touch non-Jews. They wouldn't eat their food, or they wouldn't bring them in their homes, from what I understand. And I recall reading that if they got in contact with a non-Jew, which they had to be with work, they would immerse in the mikvah in order to purify themselves. So this is the extent of the understanding of purity laws in their community, or their adopting of those laws was very strict. And this again goes back to the temple and earlier Judaism, where the purity and impurity laws were very central. A lot of it's been played down recently, not played down, but a lot of it is not as central in our Judaism today. But in earlier Judaism, it was very central. So here's an example, even seminal emissions, okay? So this is the Ethiopian Halacha. A man who senses a nocturnal emission gets out of bed and lies on the floor. Early in the morning, he goes to immerse himself, and immediately returns home with no ceremony. A man who has a nocturnal emission on Shabbat sits to the side by himself, may not be touched, and on Sunday morning, he immerses himself. So those laws, there were laws like this in Judaism with regards to emissions, but they become more lenient over time. And it's known that you can learn Torah even if you had an emission, because Torah doesn't receive tuma, impurity. But some of those laws are still in place in their community. Another piece to this is the shariat tsar. They didn't have an shariat tsar. So when you get out of the bathroom, I remember when I first became more observant, my mother was really confused and worried about me because I was doing all these weird things. So one time I was at a restaurant at the very beginning, and me becoming religious, and we went to the restaurant. It was a kosher restaurant, of course. I came out of the restroom, and she was talking to me, and I was just doing like with my mouth, kind of like with religious using. She's like, Eli, what are you doing? What are you doing? I was like, well, I'm praying. She's like, what are you praying about? I was like, well, I just went to the bathroom, so obviously I have to make a bracha. I was in yeshiva for a year. That's what everybody did. She's like, what are you talking about? You religious Jews are crazy. So that's the shariat tsar prayer that you make after you go to the bathroom, thanking Hashem for all of that. They didn't make that bracha. Why? He offers in his book, perhaps, that it's because the whole concept of purity and impurity and the discomfort with it, that they didn't make the bracha, a shariat tsar, that kind of blessing, after leaving the bathroom for that reason. Also, he talks about how they didn't have, they had their own form of brachas over food, and they didn't have the blessings before eating food that we have. And they had a certain grace after meals, but it's all very different. There's a certain language. If I can find it in 1 second, I will, but otherwise I won't. I'll just move on. But it's, let me see if I can find it here, because it's really interesting. There's a certain language to the prayer, to the brachas. Oh, here it is. Okay. So he says here, this is the language. The members of the Beit Yisrael community follow the practice of reciting Yitbarech Egziaber Amlakei Yisrael. I probably completely mispronounced that. But these are blessings. And before doing a mitzvah. So here's the blessing they would make before doing a mitzvah. God is, with translation, God is one, he is the God of Israel. He is responsible for the exodus from Egypt and revelation on Mount Sinai. This is the blessing they would make before doing a mitzvah. He is the first and the last. May he be blessed and his name be blessed in heaven above and on the earth below. There is no other. Okay, so that's the blessing before doing that. And here's another blessing. He says, just trying to see language. If he has another. Anyway, so that's the language of before you make a bracha before you do a mitzvah. Anyway, so that's like just a fascinating thing. If their language is different, they didn't have certain brachas and blessings that we have as well. I just saw something come in the chat section. Let me see. All right. So those are some purity laws. Last piece that we're talking about with the purity laws is the menstrual impurity, which you talked about here. Just see a chat is coming in here. Okay. Menstrual impurity, which you talked about here. Okay, so let me actually stop sharing. So he brings, there's a lot of laws connected to nida. Some of the laws are, if a woman's in nida, there's some leniencies and some more strict laws. So a woman's only nida for 7 days, because that's biblical nida. Okay, it means a woman's considered in the status of nida after she, while she's having her menstrual flow. So she has to separate herself from the community, though. Okay, like in ancient times where there was like a separate, women would separate themselves. There was a hut. I think we talked about this last class, but she was a hut. Women would go to this hut for 7 days and they'd stay there. They'd have no contact. They'd only be there with other women who were considered impure or in their nida period. And people would bring them food, but they wouldn't bring them food to the hut. They placed it outside the hut, outside of these stones that were colored red. And you put the food down, they would eat the food, and they'd be there for those 7 days. And they were considered like halachically impure, and they would separate themselves. And I'm just seeing if there's an interesting detail. So anyone who enters the hut for any reason becomes immediately impure, may not return home until immersing in the river. The husband must not approach the area of the hut. Okay, so that's a whole different reality that we're not familiar with. I was going to say, with regards to mikvah, so there's a lot of immersing in the mikvah. A lot of the Ethiopian communities were next to bodies of water. And I think I shared this last time, but they don't hold that our current mikvahs are proper mikvahs. Because according to their understanding, and it says in the Torah that it's flowing water. So you need actual body of flowing water. And he shared that, I forget who shared this with him, maybe his grandfather, some cases or something, that it's better to take a shower than to go to the mikvah, because the shower is at least flowing water. So that's just like just a piece on mikvahs and purity and impurity in those communities. So again, this idea of purity and impurity goes back to biblical Judaism, early Talmudic Judaism, and it's very prevalent in their law. It's all over the place, really. Okay. Another. So here are a few themes that seem to be pretty central. Lack of hierarchy, trust, and passion. So let's go through that a little bit. Lack of hierarchy. Okay. So he talks about this in his book, and we mentioned these two cases, right? So basically, you have different values, and in Judaism, in modern Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, there's all these in the first place, and then if you don't do it, there's b'diavad in the second place, and there's when there's a conflict of values, there's preference and precedence and hierarchy. He says that doesn't really exist in Ethiopian halacha. That really is an invention or an extension of earlier law, which kind of like developed and became more nuanced. He says Ethiopian halacha is lacking that hierarchy and that nuance, and that's not in a negative way. They're saying it's lacking that nuance. And the cases that he brought to highlight this is Yom Kippur on Shabbat, and also another case is electricity and on Shabbat. They wouldn't use fire or electricity. They wouldn't use electricity, obviously, on Shabbat, but they wouldn't even use fire that was lit before Shabbat. So Ethiopians on Shabbat, they would eat cold food. They didn't have this nuanced law of the rabbis, which says that if you put a timer on, which is later rabbis, but if your vessels do the work for you on Shabbat, that's permitted. They didn't have that. That's like more of a nuanced halacha, which the Torah says it's forbidden to light fire, and that's the bottom line law. Two other examples I brought on that sheet, on that slide, were Yom Kippur, which we talked about. You have to observe the Sabbath. The Torah says it. You have to give it its honor and kavod. So even Yom Kippur doesn't override that in their law, which we talked about, which is they will find a way to give kavod to Shabbat, eat something, make a kiddush, and then continue with the fast. Another example of this is Yom Kippur, with saving a life on Shabbat, which we talked about. And there's a piece here which is really interesting where he asked his grandfather about that. He asked his grandfather, he said, what's up with this? What about saving a life on Shabbat? Like, He says, I once asked my grandfather, Abba Gidon, this is the second paragraph here, of blessed memory, why they were not afraid to perform mitzvot without considering the danger involved. For example, a woman who was nida went alone to the house of impurity, where lions and wolves wandered freely. Clearly, this was dangerous for the women. He replied by telling a story. Two Jewish women who were nida, this actually is not, it's kind of like a kind of intense story, but two Jewish women who were nida were staying in the house of impurity, went to sleep, believing that God would protect them from wild animals. A non-Jewish woman came to sleep with them. The non-Jewish woman felt afraid, so she went to sleep in between the two Jewish women. That night, a wolf came inside. He pulled her out from the middle and devoured her. Okay, sorry, this is kind of like a intense story. My grandfather ended, whoever believes fully, God will protect him. We carry out God's mitzvot with full faith and trust. For my thoughts are not your thoughts. God's thoughts are the mitzvot in the Torah, and the Jew must fulfill them with no exceptions or doubt. This is the idea of a lack of hierarchy, meaning even if it means, he says here, according to Ethiopian Law, top of this excerpt, saving life does not take precedence over any mitzvah. Even if there is danger of fulfilling the mitzvah, we do not consider the danger, but rather the value of fulfilling the mitzvah. Saving life is not defined as a mitzvah. In the religious world of the Ethiopian community, there is no hierarchical division of mitzvot. There is no distinction between a minor mitzvah and a major one. Okay, so this is not just with regards to Shabbat, really. It's also goes to other mitzvot, apparently. And here's the statement of his grandfather. God has commanded us to perform a mitzvah, and we will do what is written about without further consideration. God knows what he has commanded. Something bad happens to a baby. So I can keep going with that. Okay, we don't want anything bad to happen to any babies. Okay, but you get the idea. This idea that he even says it in his book, that there's like a lack of hierarchy, a minor and a major mitzvah. They're all mitzvahs from Hashem. We have to do them with all our zeal. I'm reading. Ellen said, "Do they hold by? You can't touch. Singles can't touch each other." That's a good question. I have to look into that. I suppose so. I mean, they're very strict with those laws, but I have to look into that. So New Sephardic has prostrating on Yom Kippur. Yeah, Glenn Ross wrote that. Yeah, you can prostrate on Yom Kippur in synagogue, but they were prostrate throughout the year. So that's the difference. They were prostrate throughout the year. It was a common practice in their community. We bring it in only in Yom Kippur. Okay. So another theme in their halacha is trust. So we talked about their trust in Hashem, right? Where if you trust Hashem, you won't be harmed while doing the mitzvot. Well, a lot of it is also based on trust of the individual. They don't worry so much about what will people think. What will the community think about this person? Maybe they did something wrong. This idea of marid ayin, that people will suspect you for doing something wrong. They don't have that, he said. So this is the idea of trust or lack of suspicion. So here are two examples of that: money in shul and Shabbos, umbrellas in Shabbos, and the modeh ani. The three examples, really. So the money in shul and Shabbos, we talked about this, which is in last class, which is people would bring money to shul on Shabbos. Why would they do that? They would bring money to shul on Shabbos because they said you can't come to shul empty-handed. Okay, people would bring food to shul on Shabbos as well, and everyone would bring things to Shabbos, because in the temple that's what they used to do. They used to come to shul with a sacrifice. They wouldn't come empty-handed, and the scripture says you shouldn't come empty-handed. So they came with money. When they were in Eretz Yisrael, he told a story how people walked by an Ethiopian synagogue and they saw them carrying change on Shabbos, and they thought that they were violating the Shabbos. But he said that they didn't really have that concept of muksa on Shabbos, which is you can't touch money for different reasons in Jewish law. And he said that they trusted the people, that they would do the right thing with the money, and they would use it for good purposes, which people did. So this idea of trust is central. This idea of also umbrellas. So you can't use an umbrella. It's considered forbidden on Shabbat. He said that people brought the umbrellas and they didn't suspect that people opened them on Shabbat. They did something forbidden with it on Shabbat. There's a lot of laws in Jewish law that are forbidden because we suspect, or we're afraid that somebody will suspect you of doing something wrong. That didn't really exist as much in their community. They trusted the people, and the community, I guess, is insular enough to know that these people weren't sinning. The last example there was the modeh ani that I brought. And in the morning, we wake up and we say modeh ani. We say, thank you, God, for waking me up. He says, in Beit Yisrael, there's no regular text for prayer upon awakening. Rather, the custom was that upon rising from nightly sleep, the individual praises God for the past night and requests his protection for the coming day. Some would say a lengthy prayer, others a short one. Each individual according to his expressive ability, with the main purpose being to pray with intent. So a lot of their prayers were similar to this, where they would expect people to pray, but there wasn't something set in place because they trusted that the people would do it. So let's say, again, this idea of trust when it comes to the community and a lack of suspicion. Let's get back to. So we're going into passion here. So there's a lot of passion in their community. They developed some of their own holidays around that passion. We're going to talk about that when it comes to the Sigd. But Jerusalem was very central in their psyche. And I'm not going to go too much into this. We're a little bit low. We're lacking. We're really. We have a lot to do with a little bit of time. But this is just an interesting story where he talks about this. Joseph Halevi came to visit them in 1867, and they thought he was a foreigner. And then in the second paragraph here, he says, I assure them that all the philosophers of Jerusalem and in other parts of the world were white, and that they could not be distinguished from the other inhabitants of their respective countries. The name of Jerusalem, which I had accidentally mentioned, changed as if by magic the attitude of the most incredulous. So originally they thought he was a foreigner when he came to visit them. They didn't understand that Jews could look white, could have a white complexion or pale complexion, because they never seen that before. They doubted him until he mentioned the name of Jerusalem. When he mentioned Jerusalem, then they took him seriously. A burning curiosity seemed all at once to have seized the whole company. Oh, do you come from Jerusalem, the blessed city? Have you beheld with your own eyes Mount Zion and the house of the Lord of Israel, the holy temple? Are you also acquainted with the burying place of our mother Rachel, with glorious Bethlehem and the town of Hebron, where our holy patriarchs are buried? So that's just an example of the love and the passion for Jerusalem that was in that community for all those years, and that talks about like the passion that I feel is a central theme in their halacha. Another example of this is their holidays. They have their own some of their own holidays. Here are a few of them. The 12th day of each month is observed with special prayers in commemoration of Shavuot, which falls on the 12th of Sivan. The 10th day of each month is a special day. The main expression of this is in the prayer service. On that day, we recite special prayers that we call Yom Kippur, which falls on 10th of Tishrei. It's again extending halacha based on their passion to do more and connect to the central core of the different holidays and the customs. 18th of Elul commemorates the anniversary of the death of the patriarchs. Okay, on Yom Kippur, they would on Rosh Hashanah they had a special prayer connected to Abraham, and on Yom Kippur they had a special. They would mention Yosef, because his story and the brothers' animosity, that story happened on Yom Kippur time. So that was another piece where they extend a theme of the Bible into their holiday that we're not familiar with. And he talks about other holidays, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, which is the Sigd, which is a beautiful holiday. That's the source sheet that I forwarded to you. I think there's one more piece here. Miscellaneous laws. Okay, let's hit this really quickly. So they had women do their milas. Okay, women were the ones responsible for doing brit milah, circumcision. And the reason behind that is Zipporah in the Bible, Moshe's mother, Moshe's wife, performed circumcision. This was a common thing. Women were expected to do the brit milah. Rabbi Shalom says that his grandmother performed his circumcision. And so that's just something interesting. He says in Israel now, if women want to continue to do it, in the Ethiopian communities, they can continue to do so. And there is some precedent within tradition for that. We talked about shuckling last class. He has it in his book. He talks about, you see a lot when you go to shuls, people shuckling. He says, when I first saw this, I was completely surprised because we had never seen that in our community. In order to have proper concentration, you should stand still. And if you're going to move your body, he said they would move their hands. I think like this, he said. Last names. This is another piece where he talks about in this book. He says, Ethiopian, there were no last names. An individual known by his first name, his father's name, his grandfather's name, as was the custom in biblical times. It's an interesting thing. Last thing is reading of the Torah on Shabbat is really interesting. In Ethiopia, reading the Torah was not part of the prayer service. Following the service, the congregation went out to the synagogue courtyard. So people come to shul, they hear the Kriyas Torah reading of the Torah. Rabbi Wecker reads it so beautifully. Well, that didn't happen in their community. There wasn't a set rotation. What they did was this. Following the service, the congregation went out to the synagogue courtyard and they read from the Torah there. The Kohanim opened the Torah and they taught the people. The Kes read in Gez, while another person, usually a young Kes or someone studying to become a Kes, translated into the spoken language. The listeners could ask questions during the reading, and the Kes responded calmly. It was like kind of like a lecture or a back and forth almost. There was no defined section to be read, not like in our synagogue. They began at the beginning of the book and read until the Kes decided to stop. Okay, so if the rabbis wanted to get home for Kiddush, no, that's not what happened. That probably would maybe happen in our synagogue. But in their community, whenever the rabbi would stop, that's when the Kriyas Torah ended. Imagine that community probably, some people say the rabbi's sermon goes too long. It probably had those, if it was happening in our community, probably have those same kind of complaints when it comes to reading of the Torah. Rabbi, you read the Torah way too long today. Anyway, there was no defined section to be read. They began at the beginning of the book and read until the Kes decided to stop. No one got up without the permission of the Kes. Everyone sat respectfully and listened to the Kes and the translator. All this took place on Shabbat only. That's just like an interesting piece. Lastly, he talks about tefillin. Tefillin wasn't always prevalent in those communities. It wasn't. And he says his grandfather had tefillin, but his tefillin were not black. He showed in one of the videos. They were not colored. They were not dyed. And he suggested I recall he suggested at least the second generation start putting on tefillin. But a lot of those communities didn't have tefillin. He goes into like the history of that and why their understanding of putting a sign on your head and your heart didn't necessarily mean having those boxes the way that we understand it. So he goes into that a little bit in his book. So I wanted to talk about 2 topics in 10 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to ask that you stay with me till 10:50 because I started a little bit late. Hopefully, I wonder if I know a lot of you have so many important things to do in the next 10-20 minutes that I feel bad for holding you back from that. But nevertheless, let's do 10 more minutes of learning. It's going to be epic. You're not going to regret it. Okay. So let's do the Sig holiday. Let's do the Sig holiday. Okay, so this is a holiday. It happens 50 days after Yom Kippur. Okay, and is that right? Does that remind anybody of anything? 50 days after Pesach is Shavuot. Well, they have their own rededication to the Torah on Sig, which is their holiday, and it's actually a national holiday in Israel now, which is pretty cool. And some of my rabbi colleagues, they found ways to celebrate this. I think we should try to celebrate this. It's a beautiful holiday. It doesn't contradict halacha, and it's a beautiful way to rededicate ourselves to Torah, or at least find a way to connect to it. So the word Sig is itself gez for prostration. Is related to Aramaic ges, to prostrate oneself. So that's just like the origin of the language of the word. So here's just some pictures from the internet, from those events, from the Sig ceremony, and it's basically people come. You see the umbrellas. Remember we mentioned the umbrellas? Look, they're pretty central. He says that they're pretty central in those communities, and to tell them to kind of completely divorce themselves from that, and that it's like almost like an ornament that they bring around with them, that would be improper. We talked about that before. Now let's talk a little bit about the holiday itself and how it's celebrated. So for that, I want to share my screen with you and ask you to look at your source sheet that I handed out. Okay, so he goes this a little bit. The biblical origin of Sig is the book of Nehemiah. Okay, how does he know that? Because they read the book of Nehemiah during the holiday. So, and it says in Nehemiah that there was a rededication to the Torah. So I'm just reading the last paragraph here where it says, and they stood up in their place and read in the book of the law of the Lord their God a fourth of the day, and another fourth they confessed and prostrated themselves before the Lord their God. This is a rededication to the Torah. So what happens for many generations? So what happens on Sig? The holiday has several meanings. Okay, Sig recalls the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai as the foundation of the covenant with God. On this day, they have a renewal of the covenant and there's a lot of preparations that go into it. I'm just showing you here preparations. I'm not reading all the meanings of sig. You can look into that on your own. But there's repentance, there's reconciliation between individuals, right? So that's important too. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. The day before sig, everyone from children to the elderly prepare with great anticipation for the next day. They prepare holiday clothes and launder them. It's like getting ready for any holiday. The Kohanim slaughtered cows and sheep and prepared the meat for a celebratory meal at the end of the sig holiday. And the vegan Ethiopians prepare their tofu. No, it doesn't say that, but that's another way to celebrate that for us vegans today. Anyway, and everyone gathered in the central villages where the festival was held. In order to reach the villages on time, sometimes they had to travel long distances over several days. Okay, they would recite special prayers. Now here is the location. This is important. The sig always took place on a high hill. So they would go up to a high hill. In Israel, they have a certain hill they go to, or hills that they go to. I don't really know if there's multiple hills, but I saw them mentioning at least one hill that they go to. And why is that? Because they want to reenact Moses' ascent to Mount Sinai, and a high place is considered sacred. So here's what happens on the day. Here are some of the prayers. I'm looking in the bullet points here. They pray for Jerusalem. The congregation would be enjoined by the priest to observe the laws of the Torah, and they would read from the Torah. What would they read? From the Ori, God's revelation on Mount Sinai. They read the chapter 9 of book of Nehemiah, and they read blessings and curses. Okay, and this is beautiful. Look at this, the final paragraph. Toward the end, everyone asked for forgiveness for their sins. They went down on their knees and prostrated themselves on the ground while spreading their palms to heaven. The shofar was blown. Just as we had merited celebrating the holiday this year, so we merit celebrating it next year in Jerusalem, or the Ethiopian equivalent of the Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. Okay, the day concludes with everybody descending the mountain, enjoying dancing to the building where they held a festive meal. And so here's just some prayers. And so kind of like just, here's what he recommends. Ethiopian community should continue to celebrate Sig, which is an ancient holiday that have been celebrated by the entire Jewish people. Further, the Jews living in their homeland today are very much in need of the messages and focus of the Sig holiday in Ethiopia, which have eternal relevance, fraternal love, unity, the formation of the covenant with God of Israel and Jerusalem. Okay, so he recommends that we do it, and I think it's a nice thing to do. Find a way to connect to it. Perhaps it's a way to connect to the Ethiopian community, and there's some beautiful themes that are highlighted in that holiday. So Sig just happened actually a week or 2 weeks ago or so, but we can look into that and maybe for next year. All right, last piece I want to talk about. If you have any questions, you can put in the chat section. If I don't get to address them today, I will copy them to myself and try to address them next time. Last piece that I want to talk about is what's next. Okay. What's next for the Ethiopian community? There's a lot of struggles that they're still facing. I mean, it's not simple to uproot a whole community from a biblical community and try to plant them within a modern Israeli society that isn't completely halachic. There's modernity, there's modern halacha, there's struggles with racism, problems with literacy, issues connected to literacy, and an inability to find work, a lot of education. There's a lot of struggles ahead of the Ethiopian community. So I want to talk about that just for a moment. Here are just some advances or some success stories. You have the first Ethiopian beauty queen, first beauty queen from Ethiopia. She's a former officer in Yitish. I didn't want to pronounce it. I'm afraid I'm not pronouncing it correctly. But a former officer in the Israeli Defense Force became the first Ethiopian Israeli to win the Miss Israel beauty pageant. She was awarded the sash and crowned by a panel of judges at the International Convention Center in Haifa on February 27, 2013. Another figure is this woman. Her name is Tamona Shata. I think that's how you pronounce it. She's an Israeli lawyer, but she's also a member of the Knesset for the Blue and White Alliance and was the first Ethiopian-born woman to hold a Knesset seat. So here's some success stories. There's also a woman who did very well in The Voice, when I recall, which is The Voice in Hebrew, which is The Voice in English. A singing competition for anybody who doesn't know or hasn't been alive for the past 15 years or so. Okay, so it's also in Israel, by the way. So here are some positives and some difficulties. So more than 135,000 Ethiopian Jews live in Israel. They still face many problems: poverty, lack of education, racism, Large strides are being made every day. So in 2015, the income of an Ethiopian household was 35% lower than that of an average household in Israel. More than 35% of Ethiopian Israeli families live under the poverty line as compared with Ethiopians have sometimes been victims of discrimination. Not a lot of times, actually. Only 25% Israelis, this is so sad. Only 25% of Israelis say they want to live next to Ethiopians. That's so sad. And the government settled many of them in towns of Israel's periphery, so they're in the periphery. In 2012, residents of an apartment complex in Kiryat Malachi refused to sell or rent to Ethiopians, which provoked a protest against housing discrimination. Another protest was in 2015, it's the next bullet point. A video surfaced showing two policemen beating an Ethiopian Israeli soldier when he was in uniform, highlighting what members of the community say is a pattern of police brutality. Doesn't that sound familiar? There was a similar demonstration in Tel Aviv, turned violent, and 60 people were injured. So just a little bit there about some of the protests. But on the positive side, I'm continuing in the purple window. On the positive side, the percentage of employed Ethiopians increased from 50 to 72%. That's beautiful. Between 2003 and 2015. The percentage of women in the workforce grew from 35% to 65% in a decade. 90% of Ethiopian Jews have a high school education, similar to the 93% of the overall Jewish population. That's great. And Benny Gantz says there are thousands more waiting to immigrate. And this is an ongoing task of the Israeli government, that means real life-saving. We as a government need to integrate the immigrants who come and remember that it is not just to bring a plane with immigrants. It is a mission that will last for years. Israel holds an annual memorial service at the National Cemetery in Herzl in Jerusalem to remember the estimated 4,000 Ethiopian Jews who died trying to reach Israel. So that's something also you can connect to and find a way to maybe zoom into that type of memorial service that happens every year. Here's just a few other things that are happening in Israel. Let's read the second bullet point. Two Ethiopian women serve on the courts there. 2017, IDF soldier lit the torch at Israel's National Independence Day ceremony. Here's the voice. X Factor, sorry. 17-year-old Ethiopian Israeli Eden Aline won the 2018 edition of Israel's X Factor, as they say in Israel, singing contest in 2018. November 2018, Israel's first male Ethiopian judge was appointed to the court. And lastly, and brings it all together, the last bullet point, the International Center for the Study of Ethiopian Jewry at Ono Academic College launched a chair for research of Ethiopian Jewry. And my friend, Rabbi Shalom, is at the head of that research nucleus. So that's just a little bit, a taste of Ethiopian Jewry, their history, the timeline, the halacha, the struggles, and some of the beautiful pieces and aspects of that society, the culture, and their traditions. So hopefully this is just the beginning of some of your exposure and connection to the community, and you'll take it a step further. I sent a link in the email earlier today that Shira sent out, which details Operation Solomon. There's another one which talks about something that's happening today with the Ethiopian community, and this is only just beginning. There's a lot more work to be done in helping them integrate, and also helping us open our eyes to all the beauty that they have to offer us as modern Jews.